In response to the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, the United States in 2001 invaded the country of Afghanistan. They are still there, the troops are still there to this day. In 2003, the U.S. troops invaded the country of Iraq, and they remained there until the end of 2011. So what's my point? My point is this. For the entire first decade of the new millennium, the United States was engaged in armed conflict overseas. And while it impacted tremendously military families, by and large, your average civilian experienced life as usual. For your average civilian, life went on pretty much like normal. Matter of fact, if you avoided watching the news, you might forget that we were engaged in wars at all. Now, that's a huge contrast with World War II. Some of you maybe even remember those days in World War II when the entire nation was invested in the conflict. You couldn't go anywhere in the United States without seeing some way the nation was impacted by the war. Whole communities banded together to stage scrap metal drives. Clothing and food and fuel were rationed. With all of the men serving overseas, with so many, not all, but with so many of the men serving overseas, so many of the women went to work as electricians, welders, and riveters. Even entertainment was impacted by the war. If you look at so many of the movies that were released during the time of the war, they were created in such a way to help the public deal with their stress and their fears and their emotions over the war. Everything was affected by the war, and everyone was invested in the war. Meanwhile, our more recent conflicts, the public by and large preferred to just put it out of mind and pretend it wasn't going on. Now, I'm not here to criticize that, but to bring your attention to the contrast. The difference between a nation invested in a conflict and a nation that is ignoring a conflict. What I really want to talk about is a different kind of conflict. I want to talk about the conflict behind all conflicts, the war behind all wars. This one is so extensive that the conflicts I was just talking about, World War II, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, those are symptoms of this real war that's happening unseen behind the scenes. I'm talking about the war between holiness and corruption, between good and evil, between light and darkness. I spoke recently with someone who was going through some spiritual and personal struggles. She said that she was looking for her why. She was looking for the reason why she persists in the path that God has set before her in spite of her frustrations, in spite of the obstacles that were appearing in her way. And as she was working through this, she asked me what my why was. My answer was this. She was asking, why is it that I continue to persevere in ministry even with all of the frustrations that come into play in ministry? And let me tell you, ministry is difficult. There are a number of obstacles and frustrations that you encounter, but the question was, why do I persist? My answer was this. Because I believe that there is an invisible war going on between light and darkness, between good and evil, and I want to, if I am able, to claim whatever ground I can for good. That's my why. But the fact of the matter is, that is the why for the church as well. This unseen spiritual conflict between good and evil, between light and darkness, is a very real conflict. It is just as real as those I mentioned earlier. And it is the very reason that the church exists. The church exists to stand on the side of light against the darkness. To stand on the side of goodness and holiness against evil and corruption. That is why we exist. And so we must look as a church who the Bible calls a holy nation. We as the church must be more like the U.S. during World War II than the U.S. during the conflicts at the turn of the 21st century. We must not turn a blind eye or bury our heads in the sand about this conflict between light and darkness. We must be, every one of us, engaged in it however we can be. That is why we are here as a church. John, who wrote many of the books of the New Testament, was fond of talking about this conflict between the light and the darkness. In fact, in the first of his three letters that we have preserved in the Bible, John wrote this. He wrote that the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. You see, the way John viewed the world, from the day that human beings turned against God to pursue their own way, they had become slaves to the darkness. They had become slaves to spiritual evil. And in turn, the entire world became ruled by darkness. Darkness began reigning over this world. And it affected not just humanity, but all of the world. But the light has broken through the darkness. The light has broken into this world, and the darkness is passing away, and one day the darkness will pass away completely. But what is this light that has broken through, broken into the darkness, turned the tide of this conflict between good and evil, between light and darkness? Well, in the beginning of his gospel, John tells us all about the light. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." The Word, as I hope you've learned by now, is Jesus Himself. And if you have any doubt about that, pull out your Bible and read the first chapter of John. It's established pretty clearly later in the passage. This passage points out the fact that Jesus, the Word, is equal with God the Father. He is divine. He has divine authority. He had a role in creation. Without Him, nothing that exists could exist. But then it says this about Him. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Light, the spiritual light that the Bible talks about, is the life-giving power of God. The power of God to bring forth life and to empower that life to achieve its purpose. That's what the light is. The life-giving, holy nature of God. So when Jesus came into the world, He was in every sense the light shining in the darkness. And how has the darkness responded? It has not kateleben it. No, I didn't just have a stroke. Kateleben is the Greek word translated as overcome here. Really, it means to overtake, to seize. But it can also mean understand. That's why in some translations it doesn't say overcome, it says understand. Because honestly, we don't know which way John meant us to take the word. But the fact of the matter is, both are true. It is true that the darkness doesn't understand the light. Those who are living in darkness don't understand the ways of the light. It's foreign and it's strange to them. But it's also true the darkness hasn't been able to overcome the light ever since it shone into the darkness. But by golly, the darkness has tried to overcome the light and failed every time. At first, the darkness tried to snuff out the light by force. In the early days of the church, who are themselves the children of the light, there were persecuted by the Jewish religious authorities. You see, the darkness, spiritual darkness, evil capitalized on the self-promotion, self-importance, and even the religious zeal of the Jewish religious leadership to impose violence against the children of the light, the church. When the influence of the light spread beyond the reach of those religious authorities, the darkness used another tool, the Roman Empire, to try to snuff out the light. But that failed too. The children of the light, the church, not only became free to serve Jesus in the way He's commanded them, they also gained some influence, some power. They became powerful in the Roman Empire. And so the darkness changed tactics by undermining the children of light from within. I'm sure you're familiar with the expression, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, the darkness invaded the children of light, capitalized on their own fear of losing their power, on their own sense of self-importance. And the darkness used that to corrupt our practices and our teachings. And when reformers came along like Martin Luther and John Calvin, then the darkness used our conflict to divide us, to divide the children of light, to divide God's people, and not only divide us, but compel us to impose violence on one another. And in the aftermath of the bloodshed and the chaos, the darkness chose yet another tactic, sowing seeds of distrust in people's hearts, causing them to distrust God, causing them to distrust the children of the light, the church, causing people to distrust the light itself. So now the darkness tries to keep us in that attitude of distrust of God's goodness and light. Actually, as of late, the darkness's strategy is to try to numb us to our own innermost desires and questions that would otherwise lead us to the light. But you know what? In spite of all the attempts that the darkness has made to snuff out in the light still shines. Whenever a child or a teenager or even an adult has an aha moment in worship or in a spiritual discussion, the light gains ground. Whenever someone inclined to anger chooses instead to be gracious in the name of Jesus, the light gains ground. Whenever someone inclined to selfishness acts out of generosity in the name of Jesus, the light gains ground. Whenever someone chooses to value the life and well-being of an enemy in the name of Jesus, the light gains ground. And whenever a person chooses to devote himself or herself to following Jesus, the light gains ground. There's something very important about this war between light and dark, between goodness and evil, that we need to talk about. The tools, the weapons, if you will, of the light, the weapons and the tactics of the light are not the same as the weapons and tactics of the darkness. In fact, when the children of light ever resort to the ways of darkness, darkness has won. The ways of darkness, the tools and weapons of darkness are divisiveness, violence, pride, greed, self-interest, power, coercion. And the ways of light are wisdom, empathy, compassion, generosity, love, truth, and devotion. And any time the light resorts to the ways of darkness, the battle is already lost. Consider the Crusades when Christians waged a war in the name of Christ, imposed violence on a people who never imposed violence against them. Consider the Spanish Inquisition when Jews were tortured until they either died or were converted. And let me tell you something, a coerced conversion is no conversion at all. These are marks on the history of the church, and they are examples of when the children of light tried to fight using the weapons of darkness. Violence and coercion is not the way of the children of light. Now, I want to qualify this. That's not to say that good never has to resort to violence. Unfortunately, sometimes darkness forces the hand of the children of light. And in the defense of innocent or defenseless life, the children of light might occasionally have to stand against the darkness by force. That is what police officers do. That is what soldiers do. Now, let me tell you, if I'm sure that any parents in this room would agree that if your child was in mortal danger, you would likely resort to violence if you had to. But those are extreme circumstances, and even in those circumstances, any time, without qualification, that the light has to resort to the ways of darkness, including violence, it's one step forward and 2 steps back for the light. It's a short-term gain for the light, long-term gain for the darkness. Why is that? Because any time the light, the children of light, resort to the tactics of the darkness, even to accomplish good, it will always backfire. Whenever the light resorts to the ways of darkness, seeds are planted for future evil. Consider, for instance, our nation's war on terror. It is a reality that we cannot allow foreign radicals to pose a security threat to our nation. But even with that in our mind, we need to make sure that our humanitarian efforts match our defense efforts. Because if we aren't representing ourselves as benevolent and helpful, we are potentially breeding more terrorists for the future. The war between light and darkness is won through wisdom and compassion, not by force. I want to introduce you to a young lady named Malala Yousafzai. Got a picture of her right here. Malala was born in 1997 in Pakistan under Taliban influence, if not rule. And by the age of 15, she was already publicly speaking out in favor of education for girls. And at 15, an armed gunman boarded her bus and shot her in the left side of the face. She survived, thankfully. She relocated to the United Kingdom with her family. She's now a student at Oxford University. But there is a quote from her that I came across that I'd like to share with you. She said, "With guns you can kill terrorists. With education you can kill terrorism." This is a beautiful example of what it means to overcome with the ways of the light instead of the ways of darkness. It's a surprise that a Muslim would teach us something about what it means to be a Christian. And this isn't foreign to the Christian faith. Paul, a founder of the Christian faith who wrote most of the New Testament, wrote something like this. He said, "Do not repay evil for evil. Do not be overcome by evil, but," and this is key, "overcome evil with good." That's why it is a short-term gain and a long-term loss when the light resorts to the ways of darkness. Let's get something straight. People, human beings, are not evil. Let me say that again. Human beings are not evil. Evil is not something you can destroy with a bomb, a gun, or a punch to the face. Evil is something that worms its way into the human mind and heart, shaping the person's attitudes and behaviors. And the people who become claimed by evil are still created in the image of God. They are still people for whom Jesus died. Our war is not truly against anything we can see. Our war is an invisible one. As Paul writes, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That is the nature of the conflict that we, the church, are called to invest ourselves in, just like the U.S. invested itself in World War II. And my goal this morning is to wake us up, because this war is already going on. It is affecting everything from a global level to what is going on in your own heart right now. We cannot turn a blind eye to this conflict. And in the weeks ahead, we'll be talking more about this spiritual war that we, the children of the light, fight against the darkness. We'll talk about what it means for us as individuals. We'll talk about what it means for the church. But for now, know this. The light will lose battles, and the light will win battles. But the light is not going anywhere.